The grandmother brought her own folding chair to the Nirvana concert. That should have been Kurt Cobain's first clue that this wasn't going to be an ordinary night. The Seattle venue was packed with the usual crowd: college kids with ripped jeans, 20-somethings with mohawks, the angry and the lost finding solace in feedback and distortion. But there, in the third row, sat a 72-year-old woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a cardigan that looked hand-knitted and shoes that were built for comfort, not fashion. She had her purse clutched in her lap and kept checking her watch like she had somewhere important to be. When the opening band finished, she applauded politely, the kind of measured clapping you'd hear at a church social, not a grunge show. Kurt noticed her during sound check. How could he not? She stood out like a rose in a junkyard, completely out of place, but somehow belonging exactly where she was. The venue staff had offered her earplugs twice. Both times she'd politely declined. "Ma'am," a roadie had said, "it's going to get pretty loud in here. You might want to consider—" "Young man," she'd interrupted, with the kind of gentle authority that came from decades of raising children. "I've lived through World War II, the birth of rock and roll, and 47 years of marriage to a man who played blues guitar until 3 in the morning. I think I can handle a little noise." When Nirvana took the stage, the crowd exploded into the kind of kinetic energy that made venues feel like they might collapse from pure enthusiasm. But the grandmother just sat in her folding chair, hands in her lap, watching Kurt with the intense focus of someone studying a puzzle they were determined to solve. 3 songs in during Come As You Are, something happened that no one in the venue had ever seen before. The grandmother stood up from her chair, walked to the edge of the stage, and began waving something in the air. Not frantically, not desperately, with the patient persistence of someone who knew how to get attention when it mattered. She was holding an envelope, old-fashioned cream-colored stationery that looked like it came from another era entirely. Kurt's voice faltered. The guitar felt suddenly heavy in his hands. Behind him, Chris and Dave kept playing, but Kurt's attention had been completely captured by this woman who seemed to exist in a different decade than everyone else in the room. When the song ended, instead of launching into the next number, Kurt did something that made his management team grab their radios and venue security step closer to the stage. He set down his guitar and walked to the edge of the stage. "Ma'am," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet venue, "you've been trying to get my attention for the last 10 minutes. What can I do for you?" The grandmother smiled, not the starstruck smile of a fan, but the knowing smile of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize something important when it was happening. "My name is Dorothy Mason," she said, her voice somehow carrying clearly despite the fact that she wasn't using a microphone. "And I have something that belongs to you." Kurt felt a chill run down his spine. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't think we've ever met." Dorothy opened the envelope and pulled out a photograph. Even from the stage, Kurt could see it was old, black and white, with the soft edges that came from decades of careful handling. "This is my husband," Dorothy said, holding up the photograph. "His name was James Mason, but everyone called him Jimmy. He died 5 years ago." She paused, looking directly at Kurt. "He was a musician, too. Blues guitar, mostly. Played with some folks you might have heard of back in the 60s. Kurt climbed down from the stage, drawn by something he couldn't name. The crowd parted to let him through, sensing that whatever was happening was bigger than a typical fan interaction. When he reached Dorothy, she handed him the photograph. Kurt's breath caught in his throat. The man in the picture was playing a guitar, an old acoustic with worn binding and a sound hole that had seen decades of use. But it wasn't the guitar that stopped Kurt cold. It was the expression on the man's face. It was exactly the same expression Kurt saw in the mirror when he played. The same distant look, the same slight furrow between the eyebrows, the same sense of someone channeling pain into something beautiful. Looking at Jimmy Mason was like looking at himself across 40 years of time. "Mrs. Mason," Kurt said quietly, "why are you showing me this?" Dorothy reached into her purse and pulled out a cassette tape, hand-labeled in careful script. "For the young man who understands, Jimmy Mason, 1988. Jimmy made this the year before he died," Dorothy said. "He'd been battling cancer, and the doctor said he had maybe 6 months left. But instead of feeling sorry for himself, he spent those months in our garage recording songs. Not for any record label, not for money, just because he needed to." She pressed the tape into Kurt's hand. He kept talking about a young musician he'd seen on television. Said this boy understood what music was really about. That pain wasn't something to hide from. It was something to transform. Kurt stared at the tape, feeling the weight of something much heavier than plastic and magnetic ribbon. "He never got to meet you," Dorothy continued. "But he made me promise something. He said, 'Dorothy, if I don't make it, and if you ever get the chance, you find that young man and you tell him something for me.'" The venue had gone completely silent. 400 people were holding their breath, sensing they were witnessing something sacred. "What did he want you to tell me?" Kurt asked. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "He wanted you to know that you're not alone in this, that there have been others before you who felt the weight of the world in their guitar strings, and that the music you're making, it matters, not just to the young folks who scream and shout. It matters to old folks like Jimmy, who spent their whole lives trying to turn hurt into something beautiful." Kurt felt something break open inside his chest, not the familiar crack of pain, but something different, something that felt like recognition, like belonging to a tradition he hadn't known existed. "Mrs. Mason," Kurt said, "would you like to hear what's on this tape?" Dorothy nodded, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief that looked as carefully maintained as everything else about her. Kurt walked back to the stage, but everything felt different now. The lights, the crowd, the instruments. They all felt like they belonged to a larger story, a longer tradition of people who had stood on stages and tried to make sense of the senseless. He connected the cassette player to the venue's sound system. When Jimmy Mason's voice filled the room, gravelly, weathered, but unmistakably genuine, a murmur ran through the crowd. This wasn't grunge, wasn't punk, wasn't anything they'd expected to hear, but somehow it fit perfectly. Jimmy was singing about loss, about watching the world change, about holding on to hope when everything seemed designed to crush it. The guitar work was simple but profound, not trying to impress anyone, just trying to tell the truth. But it was the last song on the tape that changed everything. "This one's for the young man I saw on television," Jimmy's recorded voice said. the one with the blonde hair and the pain in his eyes. "Son, I want you to know something. Music isn't about being young or old. It's about being honest. And from one honest musician to another, keep playing. The world needs what you've got to give." Then Jimmy began to play a melody that Kurt recognized, though he'd never heard it before. It was the melody that had been haunting him for months, the one he'd been trying to capture in a new song but could never quite get right. Kurt looked at Dorothy in amazement. "How is this possible?" Dorothy smiled that knowing smile again. "Jimmy always said music doesn't belong to any one person. He said melodies float around in the air, waiting for the right person at the right time to catch them and bring them to life." What happened next would be talked about for decades. Kurt picked up his acoustic guitar and began to play along with Jimmy's recording. Not exactly the same notes, but a harmony that seemed to bridge 40 years of separation. The conversation between two musicians who had never met, but understood each other perfectly. The crowd listened in reverent silence as past and present merged into something neither generation could have created alone. When the tape ended, Kurt continued playing, taking Jimmy's melody and transforming it into something new, something that honored both the wisdom of age and the urgency of youth. Dorothy wiped her eyes as Kurt played. "That's exactly what Jimmy hoped would happen," she said. After the show, which had become something more like a memorial service and a celebration rolled into one, Kurt sat with Dorothy in the empty venue. They talked about Jimmy's life, about the blues musicians he'd known, about the way music connected people across time and space. "Mrs. Mason," Kurt said finally, "I want to ask you something. What kept Jimmy going? When the pain got bad, when the world felt too heavy, what made him keep playing?" Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. Jimmy used to say that every song was a letter to someone he'd never meet, someone who needed to know they weren't alone. He said that as long as there were people who needed those letters, he had to keep writing them. She reached over and patted Kurt's hand with the gentle authority of someone who had raised children and buried a husband and lived long enough to understand the difference between things that mattered and things that didn't. "Jimmy's gone now," she said, "but the letters keep getting delivered, through you, through other musicians, through anyone brave enough to stand up and tell the truth about what it feels like to be human." Before she left that night, Dorothy gave Kurt something else. Jimmy's guitar pick, worn smooth by decades of use. "He'd want you to have this," she said, "not because you need it, but because some things are meant to be passed along." Years later, Kurt would use Jimmy's guitar pick on some of his most important recordings, not for luck, but as a reminder that he was part of something larger than himself, part of a tradition of musicians who had stood on stages and in garages and on street corners, transforming pain into beauty, loneliness into connection, despair into hope. The cassette tape stayed in Kurt's collection for the rest of his life. And sometimes, late at night when the world felt too heavy, he would listen to Jimmy Mason's voice, reminding him that music wasn't about being young or old. It was about being honest. Dorothy Mason passed away 3 years later, but not before seeing Kurt dedicate his album In Utero to Jimmy Mason and all the musicians who keep writing letters to people they'll never meet. It wasn't loud music anymore, just a gentle reminder that some truths are worth passing from one generation to the next, and that sometimes the most important bridges are built not with words, but with melodies that refuse to die.